Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand. I have to start this deep dive with something that feels, well, it feels like an existential itch, a paradox that I think defines so much of modern life.
What's the itch?
It's this. On one hand, we are, publicly, a society that has never been more sensitive. We're theoretically obsessed with moral progress, with safety, with equality.
Right. The language we use, the constant dissection of privilege and injustice.
Exactly. Publicly, it feels like we're trying to engineer this perfect moral ecosystem, a place of total symmetry and intellectual enlightenment.
And this is the other side of the paradox. Simultaneously, if you just scratch that surface, there's this profound, almost frightening collapse happening underneath.
A collapse in what, specifically?
In foundational communal commitments. You look at the data for marriage, for birth rates, for commitment to a single place, it's cratering. And critically, there's a real plague of private pathologies of what some of the sources we looked at call these monstrous sexual subcultures.
So that's the tension. That's the itch. This huge gap between the public saint and the private fracture. And that's really the core of what we want to get into today.
It is. Why is the surface so pristine, so aggressively sanitized, when the deep foundations of intimacy, community, and just our personal psychology feel so completely fractured?
And to figure that out, we're not just looking at sociology or, the latest political commentary.
Yeah.
We are taking a pretty monumental leap into the philosophy of self-definition. And we're leaning very heavily on Charles Taylor's big foundational work, A Secular Age.
Taylor's work is perfect for this because he doesn't just describe modernity, he really he maps it. He gives us the conceptual key to unlock what he calls the psychological architecture of modernity.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive is to analyze this huge seismic shift that happened over centuries, this move from one type of self to a completely different one.
And crucially, to reveal the dangerous consequences that pop up when we suppress the organic, the messy, the sort of pre-irrational parts of our own nature in favor of this idealized, clean version of ourselves.
Exactly.
And in this story, we have a clear villain, antagonist, an idea that sounds safe and protective, but is actually dangerously brittle.
And that villain is the modern self, or as the sources call it, this carefully constructed, insulated fiction.
The buffered self.
The buffered self. And we really need to understand what this buffer is, how we built it, and most importantly, what profound misconception it creates about where goodness and danger and meaning, where they actually come from.
To get there, though, we have to start by mapping the world we left behind. We have to understand what it was that we rejected.
That's the only way.
Okay, so let's get into this core binary, the porous self versus the buffered self. Because understanding the world we abandoned is, I think, the only way to really grasp the psychological price we're paying for the world we live in now.
It is. We have to start with that pre-modern, deeply integrated condition. The term porous is just perfect because it encapsulates how human life was for millennia.
Porous, meaning permeable, like a sponge.
Exactly like a sponge.
Yeah.
For most of history, the boundary between you, the individual person, and the world around you, your community, the spirits, the moral forces at play, that boundary was incredibly thin, permeable. You were not a sealed-off unit.
So the self wasn't just this thing inside my head locked behind my eyes.
No, absolutely not. That's a modern idea. And this wasn't some abstract theological concept. The sources make it very clear this was an experiential reality.
What does that mean, an experiential reality?
It means things like emotions, moral forces, even spiritual entities, demons, curses, blessings, the ghosts of your ancestors. They were considered external realities that could literally impinge upon you.
Impinge, like physically affect you.
Yes. They weren't just, internal psychological states you had to manage with self-talk or medication. They were forces out there in the world that could get inside you.
So give me an example. If I felt, say, a deep, crushing anxiety.
In that porous world, you wouldn't immediately think, oh, I have a chemical imbalance or I need to work on my self-regulation. Your first thought might be that a neighbor has put a curse on you.
Wow.
Or that it was the manifestation of a demon or a sign that the whole community was in a state of spiritual disequilibrium and that force was now acting on you from the outside.
So the individual was just constantly subject to all these forces from the cosmos and the moral demands of the environment.
Constantly. To be porous was to live in a world where the spiritual, the communal, and the psychological were all just integrated. They were shared. And it could be overwhelming.
Which means the defining characteristic of this porous self was vulnerability.
Total vulnerability. You were vulnerable to spirits and blessings for sure. But maybe most importantly for this discussion, you were vulnerable to the gaze of the community and the needs of others.
Your identity wasn't your own project then. It was integrated into the social and spiritual whole, and that whole had the power to define you.
For better or for worse, you carried the shame of your community, and you also shared in its glory. Yourself was not your property.
And this must have had a huge impact on how people understood morality, on what it meant to be a good person.
A profound impact. In that porous state, goodness was absolutely not an internal feeling. It wasn't an identity you could just declare for yourself.
Or an intellectual position you held. You couldn't just, believe the right things and call yourself moral.
No, that concept would have been absurd. That's the key separation, isn't it? The sheer effort that goodness required in that world.
It sounds like it was an active, constant negotiation with the world.
It was. It demanded real engagement, real action. You were negotiating with nature appeasing the gods of the harvest. You were negotiating with the divine, fulfilling these very rigorous spiritual duties. And most immediately, you were negotiating with your community.
Through things like rituals, sacrifices.
Perpetual acts of service, all to maintain this communal and spiritual equilibrium. If the local river dried up or the harvest failed, it wasn't just bad luck. It meant something was fundamentally out of balance.
You had to do something.
You got to do something concrete, a sacrifice, a public penance, an offering, something to restore that balance. It was a morality of doing and contributing, not a morality of being and identifying.
That world sounds, it sounds terrifyingly integrated, but also completely exhausting. If being good required that much constant communal friction and spiritual fear, what happened? What convinced us to retreat from all that?
Well, the retreat wasn't a single event. It was this slow, monumental shift. The sources point to two big forces that worked together over centuries.
Okay.
First, you have the Protestant Reformation, that radically internalized spiritual responsibility. Suddenly, your salvation was mainly a matter between you and God, which shifted the whole locus of control away from the external church hierarchy.
So it starts to move things inside the head.
It starts the process. And then, hot on its heels, you get the Enlightenment, which just doubles down on radical reason, scientific materialism, and individual sovereignty.
And those two forces combined basically drove all the spirits, the demons, and eventually even morality itself out of the physical world.
And that's the transition. That's what catalyzed the birth of what Taylor calls the buffered self.
The insulated citadel.
A perfect description. A psychological fortress. The modern self has spent centuries building this hard boundary, this psychological firewall between the inner world of the mind and the outer world of, well, everything else.
So the external world becomes desacralized. It's just material stuff, a collection of neutral objects.
Precisely. And that leaves meaning and morality and ultimate value with nowhere to go except to retreat entirely into the private citadel of the mind.
So everything that matters, moral judgment, personal belief, my sense of meaning, it's all located entirely inside my head now. It's a purely private affair.
It is, which sounds like this incredible victory for individual rights, but as you said, it has enormous consequences. There was a core trade-off.
And what was it?
The trade-off is the central bargain of modernity. The buffering gives you two huge prizes, invulnerability and autonomy.
Safety.
We achieved safety. You, the buffered individual, you're no longer afraid of forest spirits or the angry god of the storm or a curse from your neighbor dictating your fate. You are an autonomous agent of reason. You're free from that external spiritual and social coercion.
So we won security, we won absolute privacy, and total individual freedom. That sounds like a pretty great deal.
It is a game, absolutely, but it comes at a very high psychological cost.
Which is?
We lost connection. And maybe more profoundly, we lost this necessary, vital engagement. The cost of all that safety is a deep psychological disengagement.
Okay, unpack that. Disengagement from what?
From everything. If the boundary between your inner self and the outer world is truly a hard firewall, then nothing outside, no community, no messy reality, no spirit, can legitimately impinge upon your internal moral reality or your identity.
So we become safe.
Yes, but profoundly isolated. And that sets the stage for the specific kind of moral self-delusion that we see running rampant today.
Well, let me just try and nail down that mechanism for the listener. Before, in the porous world, if I felt shame, it was because the community was literally looking at me.
Yeah.
And that shame was a real external force binding me to them.
It was real, tangible.
But now if I feel shame, it's just my own internal guilt. It's just a feeling in my head, which I can rationalize away or, medicate. The world outside has lost its moral teeth.
Exactly. The world outside can no longer tell you who you are or what you must do with any real moral force. That power is now entirely internalized. The external world is just noise, and your moral reality is completely self-managed. And that self-management, as we're about to see, becomes shockingly lax the moment it requires any real-world friction.
Right. So this buffered self, this insulated citadel, it values its own autonomy above all else. Now let's dig into the moral logic this new architecture creates, because this is where it fosters this unique, and I think you'd say profoundly dangerous, form of self-delusion.
It is. This is the engine of the whole pathology we're describing.
A way to be good without actually doing any good.
That's it, exactly. The critical shift is this. Since meaning and morality are now fully privatized, they're located entirely in our thoughts, our feelings, our identity, the stuff inside the firewall, the buffered person can now see themselves as moral simply based on their internal alignment with the correct ideas.
And that is the grand illusion. You don't have to roll up your sleeves, you don't have to risk your comfort, and you definitely don't have to sacrifice any of that prized autonomy.
You just have to feel the right emotions or align with the right intellectual positions. The sources really nail this by focusing on the difference between the stance and the substance of morality.
Okay, stance versus substance.
The buffered self-image lets a person hold this really high moral status while staying completely disengaged from the messiness, the inconvenience, the friction of the real world.
Whereas the porous self, as you said, had to negotiate their goodness through daily, active physical sacrifice and service just to maintain their standing in the community.
Right. The buffered self, on the other hand, it only needs internal consistency and the declaration of a correct identity. That's it.
I feel like I see this playing out everywhere, all the time, especially in the public sphere.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources highlight this perfectly. The buffered self votes correctly, they tweet correctly about social justice, they feel correctly, they display all the right signals of moral alignment. But they remain, and I love this phrase, hermetically sealed from the actual messiness of charity or community building or genuine personal sacrifice.
And this creates what we have to define as morality of stance, not substance.
The stance being the internal posture, the identity.
Yes. I believe in quality and climate action, therefore I am a good person. That's the stance. The substance is the actual inconvenient, time-consuming, money-draining action and engagement with the messy world.
Which might require, I don't know, physical labor, emotional vulnerability.
Or having your carefully managed identity challenged by uncomfortable truths from people who aren't like you. The substance is friction.
And since the primary job of the buffer is to protect the ego and maintain that precious autonomy, the buffered self almost always chooses the stance.
Overwhelmingly. It's the path of least resistance to moral self-regard. It lets you feel morally superior without ever having to risk a true, messy relationship with the outside world.
It's a kind of moral inertia then, an unwillingness to move.
That's a great way to put it. If you tell yourself, I am a globally aware, compassionate citizen, that identity feels so good that you become pathologically protective of it.
And any action that might risk that good feeling
Is avoided, like doing actual difficult charity work where you encounter people who might challenge your assumptions. That's a threat to the pristine internal stance, so you avoid it.
But I have to push back on this for a second. Isn't this just human nature? I mean, didn't people in porous societies also try to get away with the bare minimum? They probably went through the motions of rituals they didn't fully believe in. Why is the buffered self's version of this so much more destructive?
That's a really crucial distinction to make. In a porous society, even hypocrisy was an acknowledgement of an external moral authority.
How so?
You might begrudgingly perform the ritual or submit to the communal gaze, but that submission was real. It physically impacted your time, your resources, your public standing. It had a cost.
Right, it was an action in the world.
Exactly. In a buffered society, the internal stance has zero external friction. You can achieve a feeling of moral perfection entirely within the confines of your own mind or your social media feed. That makes the moral performance completely frictionless, and because of that, utterly sterile.
Sterile, that's the word. That sterile perfection is the root of the problem. Because what happens to the raw, the messy, the powerful parts of ourselves that don't fit into that shiny, sanitized, good person avatar?
What about the parts that crave aggression or hierarchy or asymmetry or just chaos?
Yeah, what about them?
Well, that's the crucial move in this whole argument. The porous self, the raw, organic, interconnected, even animalistic part of us, it didn't just vanish when we built the buffer.
It was just exile.
We shoved it into the basement of our consciousness. And now, to understand the consequences of that exile, we have to bring in another really important psychological concept.
This is the hidden mechanism.
Yeah.
The thing that turns that malaise of isolation into something malignant.
It is. We need to talk about the Jungian shadow.
The shadow.
We can define the shadow as those traits, those drives, those desires that we possess but that we actively refuse to acknowledge because they conflict with our chosen, sanitized, conscious attitude.
They conflict with the buffered ego that we present to the world.
Exactly. It's the dark side of our ideal self. But, and this is important, it's not inherently evil, it's just unconscious.
Yeah.
And organic.
And it's so important to contrast how different societies have handled this. The porous societies, you're saying, they had ways of dealing with the shadow.
They did. Through myth, through ritual, through communal structures, religious holidays, they often found structured, constrained ways to integrate those darker organic drives. They were given a place to live, a seasonal release, a role to play in the mythic structure of life.
They were acknowledged.
They were acknowledged. The
Yeah.
buffered society does the exact opposite. Because our self-image is built on these rational, symmetrical, egalitarian ideals, it pathologizes any innate drive that doesn't fit that safe narrative.
So if I feel a desire for dominance or for intense hierarchy or for total surrender,
The buffered self immediately sounds the alarm. It declares, I am a modern, egalitarian, rational, progressive. I do not have primitive urges for dominance or asymmetry or chaos. That is problematic and unacceptable.
and that denial is the lie at the very core of the buffered self. And the sources warn us about the psychological rule that governs what happens next.
That rule is the hidden mechanism powering this whole collapse. Yun warned that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate.
Okay, what does that mean in our modern context?
It means that the aggressive denial of that organic self inside doesn't make the energy go away, it just makes it mutate. It manifests as pathology in the outside world, or more commonly and more secretly, in our private lives. The suppression causes the mutation.
So let me get this straight. We've created this perfect moral saint on the surface, our buffered ego. But because that ego refuses to negotiate with the primal porous part of us, that porous energy builds up pressure until it finds an explosive and often hideous outlet in the shadows.
Precisely. Go back to the server analogy. It's like a system administrator has firewalled off all the messy, high-energy system processes because they look bad on the status report, but the server still needs that raw energy to function.
So when it's denied healthy ports,
The energy doesn't disappear. It builds up as internal corruption that eventually forces a breakdown in some unmonitored sector. The monstrous outputs we see in our culture, they aren't the organic self. They are the mutated organic self. It's what the shadow becomes when it's starved of light and recognition.
this is where the theory really hits the street. This is where the psychological cost becomes visible in our culture. If these intrinsic organic drives, the parts of us that crave things like intensity, hierarchy, and asymmetry, surrender, if they are pathologized by the buffered ego, they don't die.
They mutate.
And this explains this stunning, almost unbelievable disconnect between our immaculate public conversation and our secretly horrifying private consumption habits.
And we see this mutation most vividly in the sexual realm. The sources identify it as the last domain where the porous self fights for survival.
Why there?
Because sexual energy is raw, it's pre-rational, it's fundamentally resistant to the kind of sterilization and domestication that the buffer ego demands. It is chaos-seeking expression.
Okay, so you have the public sphere, driven by the buffered self's desire for symmetry and safety, insisting on this sanitized, equal, and safe view of human relations.
Right. Everything has to be clean, predictable, managed. We demand perfect equality and rational, carefully negotiated consent in all our public discourse about it.
But the shadow is always watching.
And because the denial is so rigid publicly, the private sphere compensates with demands for extreme asymmetry, extreme danger, and boundary transgression. It's a massive mechanism of psychological compensation at a societal scale.
So the denial creates a kind of pressure. The more rigidly the buffered self insists on its clean internal identity.
The more powerful the exiled shadow becomes, and the more violently it forces an expression. And since all the healthy, ritualized, or acknowledged channels for these intense energies have been foreclosed, they're deemed archaic or problematic, they seek refuge in these pathological, extreme forms that are completely divorced from our conscious public identity.
And there's actual data to back this up.
The sources provide pretty stark statistical evidence. They discuss the explosion of profoundly pathological themes in adult pornography consumption. Specifically, themes focused on non-consensual dynamics, extreme power asymmetry, and boundary violation.
And this is happening even within the most secular, educated, and progressive demographics, the very people who publicly champion symmetry and safety the loudest.
That's the definitive data point. If people truly were the perfectly rational, egalitarian avatars they present in public, why is the private consumption landscape the one place where the internal self finally feels safe to express its real drives? Why is it dominated by material focused on the exact opposite? The numbers just defy the public stance.
And how does the buffered self deal with that contradiction?
With a very clever trick: extreme compartmentalization. The rationalization is, this isn't me, it's just a fantasy, it's entertainment, it's compartmentalized, and it doesn't reflect my real values.
So it tries to maintain its internal moral superiority while secretly consuming the very content that violates its publicly stated identity.
It's a profound and dangerous delusion. The sources argue that the immense popularity of this material isn't just accidental entertainment. It's not just about technology. It is the scream of the suppressed porous self.
It's the organic desire for intensity or hierarchy or surrender.
All those vital but messy energies metabolizing into these monstrous mutated outputs because the buffered ego denied them any healthy integrated channel for their complex needs.
So the buffered self denies its own complexity, its own animal nature, and then that complexity finds this ugly, mutated outlet in the dork.
And the tragedy is that the output of the shadow is often precisely the thing the buffered self publicly condemns the most: asymmetry, violation, and chaos.
Okay, so we've shown how the buffer isolates us from our own true, messy self. Now we have to turn to how it isolates us from the world through the collapse of commitment, which seems just as devastating.
It's the same structural imperative. The same logic that drives pathological consumption also drives us away from deep commitment. This framework clarifies why foundational institutions, marriage, lifelong commitments, and, most pressingly, childbirth are, as the sources put it, fundamentally down the shitter across much of the modern, affluent, buffered world.
And why is that? It's because these institutions are, by their very definition, acts of radical porosity.
Exactly. They demand the absolute and irreversible breaching of the firewall.
Take marriage, for example.
Look at the demands of a real, deep, intimate partnership. It requires you to intentionally let another person breach your psychological defenses, to shape your identity, to impinge on your autonomy. You are asked to yield sovereignty over your time, your resources, your future self.
Which is the buffered self's highest, most cherished value: autonomy.
So marriage is inherently anti-autonomy.
And then there's childbirth, which the sources highlight as the most extreme example of this threat to the buffer.
It's described beautifully and terrifyingly. Childbirth is a literal biological invasion. It's followed by decades of servitude to a dependent being that drains your financial resources, consumes your time, and dictates your schedules.
It's the absolute antithesis of the autonomous, sealed citadel. A child is a non-negotiable external demand that will define your life whether you want it to or not.
And the buffered self's prime directive is insulation and autonomy. So it views these vocations, marriage, parenthood, communal sacrifice, not as forms of natural human flourishing,
but as existential, unnecessary threats to its carefully constructed independence.
The whole calculation changes. The porous self approached these commitments through the lens of vocation or fate or necessity, something larger than itself. The buffered individual approaches them not through a sense of calling or destiny, but through a cold, risk-averse calculation.
A calculation of return on investment, ROI.
Exactly. And when you calculate the ROI of a child, the numbers often just don't work for the autonomous buffered individual. Time is lost, money is lost, freedom is lost, career trajectory is often compromised.
And the very idea of sacrifice becomes illogical.
It becomes a threat. Sacrifice requires a porous connection to something larger than the self, a lineage, a god, a community, a purpose that transcends the individual ego. The porous person felt bound by destiny to their ancestors and their descendants.
But if you've sealed off your mind and located all meaning internally, if you are the center of your own moral universe, then there's nothing truly larger to connect to.
And no justification for that surrender of sovereignty. The buffered self literally cannot process the concept of sacrifice as a path to meaning. It only registers as an illogical threat to autonomy.
And the outcome is what we see all around us.
Utterly predictable. A
Right?
retreat. The individual pulls further and further into their buffered shell, maintaining their precious internal moral superiority. I am smart, I am rational, I am free. While the organic foundations of human life, intimacy, reproduction, legacy crumble all around them.
They remain existentially sterile.
Prioritizing control over vitality. And all the while, the monstrous shadow grows in the dark, and life itself retreats from the light.
And that retreat, ironically, it just reinforces the denial. If you avoid the challenge of marriage and children, you never have the opportunity to integrate the messy, aggressive, or chaotic parts of yourself that those relationships demand.
The shadow remains unchecked. The lack of porosity and commitment directly feeds the pathology in private life. It's a vicious cycle.
This whole structural analysis, it provides such a clear, almost terrifying explanation for that deep sense of unease that seems to haunt the modern age, this underlying anxiety beneath the surface of all our supposed progress.
It's exactly what Taylor called the malaise of the secular age, this feeling that something essential was lost when we built the buffer.
And as we've detailed, that malaise has, it seems, turned malignant, because the buffering prevents the integration of that vital, messy energy.
We have achieved a highly specific and deeply problematic state of societal being. We have created a mass society defined by three simultaneous, often contradictory realities.
Okay, what are they?
First, we are publicly saints, utterly convinced of our own goodness through our internal identity, our moral stance, and our intellectual purity. We are defined by our declared positions.
Second, we are privately fractured. We are compelled to act out suppressed, monstrous drives in the dark because our conscious, buffered ego pathologically denies that those drives even exist in our perfect self.
And third, we are existentially sterile, fundamentally unwilling to break our own buffer, to let in the essential, chaotic, life-altering demands of genuine love of children, of any radical, life-defining sacrifice. We choose control over life.
Self-delusion at scale is indeed a hell of a thing. That's a powerful summary for this entire intellectual structure.
It is, because the implication is that the solution isn't more control, or more buffering, or more safety protocols. It's not more denial of our complex nature. The only sustainable path forward requires a courageous and very difficult reintegration of the porous, organic self.
Allowing ourselves to be shaped and, yes, impinged upon by the external world again.
That's the only way.
To really make this stick, let's go back to our master analogy one last time. Let's cut through the philosophical jargon and bring this home for anyone listening. So the buffered self is like a heavily firewalled, locked-down server running an operating system.
And this server is running an idealized profile. We'll call it the good person avatar. It's perfectly clean, it's logically flawless, and it denies any messy, inefficient, or potentially aggressive system processes that don't fit its rational, clean narrative. It is the pinnacle of digital self-management.
But the underlying hardware, the organic self, is still running all those messy, primitive functions in the background. Raw energy consumption, asymmetrical data demands, and this unavoidable need for external network connections and hardware friction.
And because the firewall is absolute, those necessary system processes, the shadow, are denied any healthy, controlled access to the main system. They don't vanish, they just build up as corruption in unmonitored sectors.
Which causes the system to crash privately, or manifest as unexpected, often malicious background activity.
The secret consumption, the sudden rage, the deep anxiety, all the things the idealized profile pretends not to see.
And the only way to fix that server is to consciously and courageously open the necessary ports, to allow some of that messy, high-energy system information to integrate, even if it compromises the perfect, sanitized performance metrics.
It means letting the external world or another person truly define and shape you again. That's the work of reintegrating the porous self. It's terrifying, but it is the path back to vitality.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider. If you've listened to this deep dive and you recognize the structure of the buffered self in your own life, you have to ask yourself a hard question.
What specific, organic, intense part of your own nature? What desire for intensity, for asymmetry, for surrender? Have you recently pathologized or exiled simply because it didn't fit your internalized good person avatar?
What necessary chaos, the messiness of commitment, the surrender of autonomy, the inconvenience of service, are you actively refusing to let into your life? And what shadow is quietly growing in the dark because of that refusal? The buffer feels safe, but safety often precedes sickness.
Thank you for joining us for this crucial deep dive into the architecture of the modern soul.
Until next time, keep digging.